Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Deep Learning Podcast with PolyAI. I'm your host, Damien. I'm here with Nikola. We are actually in the same room, just a couple cubes apart. Nikola, I'm in London. How are you? Thanks.
Good. Yeah, I don't think we figured out how to set up one room, so we still use it's not fair, but hey, good to have you here.
Yeah, definitely great to be here. And it's really, really exciting to get away from the States because right now we are in the thick of a political battle of epic proportions. As you may have heard, we're fast approaching the 2024 presidential election. It's a hot one. A lot of spice in this race.
Yeah, I flew in from Chicago yesterday, so glad to, glad to be reunited here. But yeah, it's nowhere near as exciting. We have a new prime minister here, and self-proclaimed centrist without radical beliefs who wants to unify the nation. We'll see how he does, but we're out of the throes of politics for now.
Yeah, for now, and enjoy that lull. Meanwhile, back in the States, we are getting inundated with messaging on all platforms. Campaigns are in full force. And of course, that leads to the possibilities of pop-ups here and there, showcasing how videos are being deepfaked with some candidates saying things that they never said, et cetera, et cetera. It's putting a whole new lens on the application of really progressive artificial intelligence video models on an omni-channel front. But part of that it includes getting those calls from campaigns and PACs that are essentially trying to convince you to go for their candidate. Here's the issue, though. It's now becoming indistinguishable from playing sound clips of things that candidates may have said, but actually didn't say. And so I thought a good conversation topic for us to chat about today is, as a leading mind in voice AI, conversational AI, and obviously what we do on the commercial front, just giving folks some tips as to how if they suspect that they're receiving a call, uh, it's coming from a potential voice AI bot,
Yeah.
how they can go about breaking it to see what's legit and what isn't, and kind of filtering through the deepfakes. A lot of states have already put some legislation in motion that apply really severe penalties to
Yeah.
any organization that's caught deepfaking video. It's also applying to voice. So from an
Yep.
omni-channel front, uh, in your opinion, why? I mean, it's obviously easy, it's accessible. What are some other reasons why this is running so rampant?
I mean, listen, and when there's technology, people use it in all sorts of ways just because they're interested in trying it out, right? I think, you know, in America is always the land of advertising and, at the forefront of it. It's just another form of ads, right? So, like, why not, right? I was always surprised with how much more effective telemarketing was in the US relative to Europe, right? And despite the numbers of calls that people are still willing to stay on the line, right? I would have thought people would just hang up immediately for pretty much any number you don't know. That's what I do. Uh,
That's definitely what I
and
do. A lot of people don't, though, especially older people who are voters. Yeah.
yeah, that's, I think, the crux of it, right? I think, like, as much as, we have committed our lives to creating technology that is virtually indistinguishable from humans because we think that,
Mhm.
for us, the mantra was always like, don't trick people into thinking you're human, help them
Right.
forget that you're machine, right? Make it smoothless, and like that pursuit is fun, right? But when it comes to like these kinds of activities, I think like if you want to be really nefarious, it's really the cocktail of, you know, virtually completely human coupled with voice cloning, where things get really, really dodgy, right?
Right.
And the demographic you mentioned, right? Older people who might not be at the forefront of what's going on, they just don't even think about whether it's real or not, right? And I think that's at the core of like how it can be abused, right? Um, because if you don't think, it can be fake, right? And then you hear it and the voice sounds really real. You
Hmm.
like park that whole like doubt, suspicion, park it away, right? You don't think about it. And the truth is like then when you engage, like the system will probably respond okay, right?
Yeah.
And there are tells, right? It really depends on the design of the system around like things you can and cannot do. I think we can probably list a few things that you can do, right? To see if it's human or not. Like to me, the most obvious one. Um, let's take like pronunciation, right? And
Right.
think of think of like Birmingham, Alabama versus Birmingham in the UK, right? People say it differently. It's spelled the same, right? And, I think if you spoke with a human and you said, "Hey, look, I've been getting a lot of robocallers. I hope you don't mind. Would you mind saying Birmingham for me?" Right? And, if it's a prompted LLM, it might be smart enough to go say Birmingham, right? But you go like, "No, no, no. Can you say it the way Americans do? Birmingham," right? And like, if they're using speech recognition, they're translating that into that thing.
Right.
The model is not conditioned to do that, not yet, right? And this is where I think like you have a modality discrepancy between like, text in, text out LLM powered by speech recognition that doesn't encode your stress, right? It's
Right.
not to say we won't get there. I'm sure we will, right? But we're not there yet, right? So,
Right.
similarly, we could play like, hey, my last name is Mekšić. Can you repeat that? And of course, like, you can't. No one can. A few Serbs and Croats, right? But like, um, it's really like, you're gonna like struggle and like how it struggles because you'll get a mistranscription, right? And it will say some other word. And it's clearly not that. A human knows that it's not that. To a human, it's obviously a weird Slavic name, right? And like,
Okay.
oh, I'm just gonna have to like butcher it up a little. So I think that's like one way you can do it, right? Other things are you can just like um I think that's the simplest fail-safe, right? Because the model will just get very confused. The other thing obviously is like
Well, it also
late.
seems like it yeah, yeah. Latency just in a second, but it seems like one of the reasons that might, I mean, aside from the dynamics and the actual like text to speech and speech to text and a loss of like the stress capabilities, is that it's also a pretty odd question to ask. So if you get a response from an LLM that's essentially just like, okay, I'll try again, and they're not at all put off by the fact that you're inquiring about it, that to me is another indicator, right? Ask a weird question, see how the LLM responds. If it responds as though what you asked was perfectly normal, then chances are it's automated.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, like once people start doing the obvious things there,
Sure.
they're part of the problem says if you're asked a weird question, that wants to, the safeguards or whatever LLM is being used, fail or don't exist, uh, then, like that's something we can work against, right? So, hey, why would you
True.
ask? Do you think I'm a bot? And that person, oh, okay. Like, fine. Your test fails, right? Maybe, right?
True.
And the other thing, obviously, there's a certain clunkiness to voice interactions still, right? Where, you have a design choice for the most part between allowing easy interruptions, right? And if you say anything to the background, like say you were talking to me on the phone and I'm with someone in a car and I go, like, yeah, yeah. Like, you hear that and you stop talking, like it's kind of obvious that, the reactiveness won't be
So
or
if
something or whatever. Like,
mhm,
every time come out, like, you'll get that, like, you'll model out that they're probably saying something to someone. You caught them on the phone, you understand that. Like, again, that ability to park that in your mind and just continue talking the way a human would, right? Versus being interrupted. That's one way. Now, if you can't interrupt it,
is
in design wise, if you can't interrupt, then like you're like, oh, okay, this is automated, right? And when you build automated systems, it actually, for the most part, that we can see in our millions of interactions, it makes sense to not allow barge in for most actual pieces, things you're going to say. Because if you allow easy interruptions, it can really take the conversation off track, right? Um, but a human would. That's like one way in which we're still better than like the best machines running out there.
so is that two ways? So obviously there's the element of if it doesn't allow you to interrupt, then that's wrong. But what about it interrupting you, or if you're having a conversation with that person in the background and it thinks that it's still receiving input? Is that a current like trigger? Would you say that that's not, or that there are mechanisms that get beyond that?
Well, then a human could get confused. It's like, hey, sorry, what are you saying? Like, what do you mean with that, right?
I guess
So
that's
like,
true. Yeah.
that can be confusing, right? So I don't know if that's like an easy to apply test, right? But like, you could definitely just think about like, if you can't interrupt it to save your life, then it's probably, and how you interrupt and how it reacts to interruptions is again like a thing. So it really, I think, depends. The first thing we talked about it depends on whether you're okay, like potentially embarrassing yourself by starting to say random things, right? They're like, hey,
I have
Josh,
no problem doing that. I
why
mean,
are you
anyone who's a
showing?
fan of the podcast knows
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Why are you asking me what does a Kepler want? Right? Like, you're like, "What?" Right? Or like if it knows an answer to a particularly weird question, that's also a bit suspicious. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, very
Well, that's
suspicious. That's a really good
like,
point.
yeah, it's like, yeah, I think like you can have a lot of fun with it. It's really like because it's very powerful, but it's also quite crude in where it's been placed. Right? So like
Yeah.
it's apt to ridicule it a little and mess around. And like you said, if it complies or just doesn't get weirded out in a way that a human would, well, tough. You've been called out, right? And like
Right.
the barrier will like get tougher and tougher, right?
What now we talked a little bit about this with regards to barge in and like being able to detect when there's more input coming in and sort of like active listening as far as bots go, but that also lends to an appropriate latency, which is another indicator. What I mean, what are we talking about? It's as humans converse and they talk, like there's a real fine science between like knowing when to shut off the listening ears and turning on. And you and I, we banter, we talk over each other a lot. Bots really can't do that yet, but it is getting more and more difficult. What are some latency flags that people should be looking for when they're having these conversations and are suspicious?
Well, I mean, this is where like I think we're not actually like that. It's not one that can be used reliably because you can configure these systems to have very low latency, to be very sensitive, right?
Right.
I you were saying something, I was like, "Yep, yep," and that, like, encourages you to keep talking, like, that's not something that we built into these systems just yet, right? To kinda, like, have a stream where we model in your feedback while we're talking, right? Like, the other thing, of course, is, like, if they're taking very long to respond, like, I think you're gonna have I think for us, like, that is probably what gives away a lot of our systems, right? People see that there's a
Okay.
lag, but it works. They just, like, interact with it, and that's the implicit signal that it's not human, and that's okay. Right? You can tweak it the other way to be hypersensitive and react, which will lower latency. Um, and if you do, like, if you're in a quiet room demoing, like say, if you saw the OpenAI demo day where they were demoing low latency with a guy plugged his phone with like an Ethernet cable in,
Right.
right? Like, yeah, okay, well done, you've cut down one round trip time, right? Um, you can demo those things, but like they really break down in production. If you're in a car driving and you know, like you hit a bump, you hear a sound, thing stops talking. Like you kind of know. But now we're talking about things that I think we're pretty far from like needing like that. Like,
Okay.
barge in and they continue talking for like another 5, 6, 7 seconds. There may be people who do that on the phone, but like
Not a
I think
lot. Not when it's an inbound call of someone trying to
yeah,
convince something, Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But like there are situations where, for example, like uh it's an offshore contact center running through VoIP. It's not configured particularly well. Like, you must have been on phone calls where you've had latency with someone, right? Like,
Sure.
video calls, it happens all the time with Google Meets, right? Like, I think this week alone, I had a few one-on-ones where I'm like, okay, my video, your video, let's turn it off. And there's a 2-second lag, so we learn to not interrupt. We kind of talk as if we're sending emails.
Oh, wow.
Like, that can happen. And like, if that could happen with a contact center, especially, complex routes through like different, CCAS environments, like handed off to a third party contact center that again routes it through its own telephony. Latency can add up with humans as well. So I don't know if that's completely fail safe, right?
But then there's what happens after that initial latency bump, how it's identified on both sides of the call, et cetera. And you could sort of trust your gut to say, oh, this is a human reacting to latency issues along the telephony stream, as opposed to this is something that's been programmed by within an LLM,
That's
within a bot to sort of respond in this awkward way that most humans would if there were connection issues.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. But I think it's a brand new world. There will be more and more of it, right? And
Sure.
if you don't suspect it, then you can get tricked very, very easily, right? I think we have a number of calls where people really, start off thinking that it's a human. They go, "Oh, are you a robot?" We also have calls where people start off, they hear it's automated, but then like they hear a few things that sound really like incredible, and they go like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I was speaking with a human. I've been really rude. I don't know if I ever played you those." But like, it's interesting, right? And
What about asynchronous stuff? What about pre pre-recorded content that it's, I mean, that eschews any ability to break a bot, right? Because there's no engagement, there's no interaction, there are no conversational turns. Are there some audio cues that right now you can sort of try and fine tune your ear to differentiate, or is it becoming more and more impossible?
I think it's getting borderline impossible. I think you can probably do
Okay.
forensic analysis of it where you would find patterns that are generated that like an expert could like identify, right? Like they do with like, you know, you know when people like figure out that a photo's been photoshopped because like some pixels look weird, right? But that's like not something you can do with the naked ear. I mean, we had like a deep fake of my with 10 samples.
Yeah.
I got 3 out of 10 right. And it took me a long why it was why am I so bad at like detecting my own voice, right? And the truth was, clone was tweaked from like a US English model, right? Despite living in London, I never really picked up any shreds of a UK accent, right? And the model, the generated model, spoke like American English with like a more American accent than me. It was me like 5 years in the future when I, tweak my pronunciation further, right? Away from my like Serbian based
Yeah.
model. And I was like, why am I getting it wrong? And we did it a few times and I kept like I preferred the generated version to my own recordings, right? And the truth is, it just had less of an accent, right? Like accent versus accent, right? Like the versus the,
Interesting.
stuff like that, right? It just basically made me a better speaker of English. So
That sounds like it could be a tool to benefit a lot of candidates as
there are
opposed to using
companies
it for
doing it.
nefarious reasons.
There are companies doing this. Again, like latency is a bit of an issue. I find it to be like racist, right? Like I think accents are interesting, right? I think a
Yeah.
lot of the applications of this are, offshore contact centers with speakers of, like a different form of English. Right? I think a lot of them are in India, right? So like the demo is typically like someone speaking like Indian English and being converted into like a generic American, right? And like I don't care much for that, right? But it's interesting, right? It can definitely be done.
That is really interesting. But again, kind of going back to the affectation of accents, like very subtly, but just making maybe a person, a personality of voice a little more compelling and making it more targeted to the person who's listening.
Yep.
Like thinking of instead of, using a pre-recording of a voice or a cloned voice of your opponent and having them say something nefarious, you clone your own voice and then make it a little softer, a little more regionally appropriate for your accent to whatever phone bank you're calling into. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you could. I don't know if it's needed, if our lives would be any worse with or without it, but hey.
Well, I know, but we also have a hard time identifying our voice, right? So do you think your wife would have gotten a better score on hearing your 10 clone samples?
I'll try. I'll let you know in the next one. I don't know.
All
I
right, come
don't
back
know.
on the
I really
scorecard.
like 'cause the other thing, of course, that we did in testing, we did it over the phone because we were really careful about
Sure,
implement things around over the
of
phone.
course.
That, like, basically low band filter that you apply makes the voice poorer, right? Like the signal is weaker. It's not like this microphone, it's the phone, right? Going through kind of
Sure.
so many different, like we notice, for example, degradations of performance. If you call through like, how like applications have that like global calling thing where you can like pay Viber or like other apps to like call any number in the world, right? But it goes through voice over IP, right? So
Yeah.
voice over IP, that part uses a different filter to like national telephony, right? And these days, even the telcos are probably putting your voice through VoIP, especially if you're calling something abroad.
Okay.
It's able to often, get like much lower rates. And while
Right.
like roaming rates are
Cheaper,
different.
free.
Well, yeah, I mean, they've basically gotten to the point where a US to a UK call is not really going through an expensive telephony network where you have to pay much, right? So it's
Right.
only really their choice if they want to like tax you for doing it, right? And that's why, you know, and then what's interesting also is that like national telephony, like they don't use, I think there are two or three different kinds of these filters. So if you apply them all, like you lose further clarity and accuracy of the voice, right? So
Hmm.
more you do it, like you're used to a phone line being, you know, weaker and the signal not being crisp. And you know that feeling
Sure.
when there are two good camera setups and you hear someone really well, you see them well, and you're like, wow, this is like better than usual, right? I can really hear you, right?
Hmm.
If I used a microphone the way you always tell me to for a podcast, my voice would not sound better, right? So like telephony is just like, and this is a good thing for fakes. Not sure it's a good thing, but like for them to seem more real, it's harder to tell because you're already like inflicting a lot of like loss onto the signal. So it's hard to tell.
But maybe that is an indicator itself. If it sounds too clean, if it sounds probably at a higher level, then you could be dealing with a pre-recording or a synthesized voice. That's incredible. Hey, look, I know we're running out of time here. This has been really, really fascinating. I hope that this offers some tips for folks who are getting those barrages of calls for political and other reasons. Hopefully it's not too bad, but as the technology gets better, of course, there are going to be better mousetraps, right? So appreciate your time, Nicola. It's been a lot of fun and we'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, I mean, look, or just don't pick up your phone until the 5th of November, right?
So always the best advice.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, man.
Cheers. Bye.